I think, 3 years old when I was told about God for the first time, that God has created everything. And then I asked my mother, who created God? And she was appalled. And she said, nobody asks that. Nobody created God. Don't ever say that again. And she freaked out. That wasn't the only thing I did as a kid. I was quite an unruly child. But then I grew up around Islam. We used to read the Quran every day. I was memorizing part of it without actually understanding it, just the Arabic. So I can read and write Arabic, but I don't speak Arabic. So I don't know what it means, but I know how to read and write it. I was memorizing a huge portion of it. I was, deep into the whole argument of, we need to reach the perfect society and we need to get to that point, and everybody's letting their politics come into religion and are manipulating Islam for their own sake and blah, blah, blah. So I used to say that against the religious extremists in the country and the religious parties in the country, because we don't have anybody who's an atheist. Like, I hadn't met anybody who was an atheist until way after I personally decided that I was. It's 98% Muslim in Pakistan. So as I started getting more and more into religion, I actually started getting more into religion than most people around me, because Pakistan, contrary to the impression, people are not as religious as you may think. It's more about the rhetoric and just it's spiel. People don't pray mostly, people party, alcohol, even though it's illegal, is available. And that is one thing that all the TV channels know. They censor it out. All the news reports know. They censor it out. They just don't publish it because it's against the law, and then the state will have to do something against the elites who actually are partly the state themselves. So you have that side, and then you have the other side where you have this Islam growing, which I would call the Wahhabi Islam, because that's how it was introduced to me. However, as I learned more and more, that perception sort of changed a little as well. Now, the Wahhabi Islam is about exactly what is in the Quran, what is in the Hadith. We need to discard all of the thousands of years of history, actually 1,400 years of history, sorry, of Islamic thought and all of that, and just stick to what the Quran and the Sunnah has said, so that we can basically be true Muslims, and that everybody else is actually a non-Muslim. And then I started going to different classes and sessions until one thing happened. I mean, I bought into the logic, everything made sense to me, the whole world made sense to me, everything just fit perfectly together, until there was a clash. When I first started understanding the Quran and reading its meaning, came to an ayah in Surah Nuh which said, men are the guardians, protector, different versions of this, but in that class it was said, men are the guardians of women and they're a degree above them. And I was so perturbed by this, because growing up in an extremely misogynistic country, it's the third worst in the world for women, I had to fight against my mother, my cousins, my father especially, everybody to say, I am an equal. And I remember as a child, I used to deny that women are actually weaker physically than men, because that's what everybody used to throw at me. That, oh, men are stronger, hence they're superior. And I used to say, no, I could beat any of my cousins right now. And then I used to wrestle them. So, so having come to that point where I actually heard that God is saying in his own words that women are inferior to men. Even though they're equal in his eyes, in the social framework, they're inferior to him. I couldn't come to terms with it. I went up to the teacher and I asked her, why? She said, because they have more responsibility, hence they have more power. And I said, what if I were to take more responsibility? I want to work, I want to have a life beyond that of just raising children. And she said, well, still, it's not mandatory for you to do. So if you do it, it's optional, it's your choice, but that doesn't relieve you of your burdens in life that God has given you, and hence you don't get that power. And I just couldn't believe that. So I'm just going to read this one little quotation from the Quran, which basically says, whenever Allah and the Apostle have decided a matter, it is not for a faithful man or woman to follow a course of their own choice. So I was at a crossroad. Either, give up all of my perceptions of what is right and wrong, my personal morality, because I actually had one, which was separate from religion, which I didn't know until that very point. That was when I discovered that my ideas about life are actually not entirely dependent on religion. And then either I had to give that up and follow, submit, or I had to basically discard everything and say that, you know, sorry, I don't believe in anything. But I couldn't do that, of course. I mean, it took me, I believe, maybe 7 years and countless oscillations of, you know, saying there's no God, then saying no, there is a God. I've considered myself very close to God. I used to talk to him, I, you know, turn to him in my weakest moments. And there's this thing in Islam where you're supposed to remember God all the time. When you wake up, the first thought on your mind needs to be God, and, you know, it's this whole thing, and basically whatever he says has infinite wisdom in it, and you cannot question that. And then that's just like a brief overview of where I'm coming from and who I am. And after much education, I actually undertook, as a part of my undergraduate degree, I became a lawyer. As a part of that course, I studied Sharia law and Islamic jurisprudence for a year, and I also, during my practices, I was defending the, you know, clients of blasphemy. I actually got even more deeper into different things relevant to that. And during a feminist developments in feminist theory class, I actually embarked on this research project about the whole women's rights issue, because that was a real stickler for me, and I couldn't choose Islam without resolving that. So I went to the gut. So now, whenever you ask a Muslim apologist about women, what do they say? Oh, you know, Islam is the religion that has given them the most rights. Before Islam, you know, it's called the Jahiliyyah period. Jahiliyyah means savage, illiterate, uneducated. And it was the Dark Ages, and, you know, women were like cattle, they were property, they couldn't do anything, they were basically, you know, there was female infanticide that was so prevalent, and so on and so forth. Like horrible tales of how women's condition was. And basically all women were slaves, and all women were somehow killed as babies but still survived. And I remember questioning that as a kid. I asked my mom, if all the babies were killed, how were there any women to procreate? How did humanity proceed? And my mom was like, well, you know, they let some of them live. So, men and women, of course, took multiple spouses, all of that. And until I came across, you know, cultural anthropology and feminism, and I discovered that actually Saudi Arabia, to a large degree, was a matrilineal society, and I was struck by that. And then that's where my research began into this, and I just wanted to share some of that with you guys, because I think that that is what is used as a huge basis of the justification of the subjugation of the woman, as well as, you know, of the elevation of the Sharia law on the subject, as well as to say that, you know, it's okay to do this to 51% of the women, essentially. I mean, 51% of the population of the earth, but I would also, what I would add to this before I get into it, is that the problem that I came towards, you know, the head-to-head, where either submit entirely in the way that it is, or discard it all, which essentially in a Muslim state would mean death. I could never tell anyone in Pakistan what my beliefs were. My parents were freaked out about this. I told them, and my mom thinks that since the Prophet got his revelations at the age of 40, when I turn 40, I will as well see the light. So she you know, calls me and threatens me that don't eat, you know, pork, and don't eat in those utensils, otherwise we're not going to let you enter the home because you'll be unclean, even though you don't believe in it, follow this. So she's trying to keep me, you know, clean and pure as much as she can, even though she knows I no longer believe in the Islam that was taught to me. I'm still on the edge towards whether I want to call myself a cultural Muslim or not, because there's certain aspects of the culture that I like, there's certain that I despise. And that's an identity question that I will eventually, I suppose, resolve. However, I have a right to that identity, whether or not I believe in God, whether or not I believe that Quran is the word of God. I have a right to that identity, and nobody has the right to take that away from me. That's it. Now, I think that also is the biggest problem of Islam today. The crisis of Islam, essentially, is that it's come to a point where it can no longer apply in the way that it is, and it's refusing to evolve. It's refusing to change certain things. And if you don't do that, what happens? I mean, eventually, like if a stick's not going to bend, it's going to break. And Islam has to bend. That's what has to be done. So generally, I think what I would do is, very briefly, looking at the time, is first of all talk about the matrilineal society that exists. And I must say, I was extremely struck